At 7:55 on the quiet Sunday morning of December 7, 1941, Mess Attendant Second Class Doris Miller stood alone in the humid laundry room deep inside the USS West Virginia, folding a neat stack of white officer uniforms. 3 decks above him, the sunlight over Pearl Harbor was just beginning to warm the still water. Miller had been awake since before dawn, already working through his usual Sunday routine. The laundry room smelled of soap and steam, and the only sounds were the thrum of ventilation fans and the soft slap of wet fabric being folded clean. At 22, Miller had settled into the rhythm of Navy life. He had grown up in Waco, Texas, joining the Navy 2 years earlier because the pay was steady and his family needed money. The Navy had offered him exactly one job, because for black sailors in 1941, there was only one job available: mess attendant. Cook, dishwasher, cleaner, servant. He served meals to officers, cleaned their cabins, washed their clothing, and stayed out of the way. Combat roles, weapons training, and battle stations involving guns were forbidden to him by regulation. He knew the routine so well now that he could move through his duties half asleep. On Sundays, he collected uniforms at 7:30 sharp. By 7:55, he was right where he always was, folding shirts as the ship gently swayed at anchor. Then the world exploded. The first torpedo slammed into the West Virginia with a sound Miller had no frame of reference for. The blast threw him against a metal bulkhead, knocking the breath out of him. The lights flickered violently and went dark as emergency red lamps snapped on, bathing the room in a dim crimson glow. The entire ship trembled beneath his feet. From somewhere above, he heard shouting, footsteps pounding through passageways, the shrill tone of alarms erupting at once. The floor under him tilted sharply. Water thundered somewhere deep in the bowels of the ship, an unnatural waterfall inside steel walls. Without thinking, Miller sprinted toward his assigned battle station. He had drilled on this countless times. Get to your station. Stay at your station. Do your job. But when he reached the magazine where he was assigned, there was no station left. A torpedo had torn a hole straight through the hull. The space where he was supposed to work was now a twisted cavern of shredded metal and violent white water flooding in through a jagged opening more than 20 feet wide. Through that hole, he could see sunlight and the harbor outside. The magazine was gone, just gone, obliterated by an explosion he had survived only by chance. Sailors around him fought desperately to close watertight hatches, dragging hoses and equipment through knee-deep rising water. Another torpedo struck forward of his position, rocking the entire ship again. Within minutes, the West Virginia had taken multiple torpedoes, each one tearing open a new wound. The deck leaned farther and farther to port as thousands of gallons of seawater poured in. If the list grew much worse, she would roll over like the Oklahoma nearby, a ship Miller would later see turning belly up like a dying animal. He climbed toward the main deck, fighting through smoke and chaos. When he emerged into the open air, the sky was alive with Japanese aircraft. Dive bombers screamed down like hawks. Torpedo bombers skimmed just above the water, their shadows racing across the harbor. Fighter planes strafed everything moving on the decks below. The entire battleship row was engulfed in fire, smoke, and thick black oil blooming across the water. Arizona was burning so fiercely that flames shot hundreds of feet into the sky. Oklahoma was already capsizing. The harbor was filled with men swimming, men screaming, men on fire, men trying to drag wounded shipmates away from flames spreading across the surface like a living thing. The smell of burning oil, cordite, and hot metal filled Miller's lungs. A frantic officer grabbed him. The captain was wounded. They needed help. Miller followed him up to the bridge, climbing ladders slick with oil. Captain Mervyn Bennion lay on the deck, gravely injured. Shrapnel from a bomb that had struck the battleship Tennessee nearby had torn through his abdomen, ripping open flesh so badly his organs were visible. Blood soaked the deck beneath him. Yet the captain was still conscious, still issuing orders through clenched teeth, counter-flooding instructions, fire suppression priorities, commands to save his ship even as he held one hand desperately against his wound. A pharmacist's mate had applied a dressing, but the bleeding would not stop. The captain refused to be moved. He would die at his post, and Miller saw in his face a kind of determination he would never forget. Another officer barked an order at Miller. They needed help at the anti-aircraft guns. Miller ran across the deck as bullets hissed past him. He reached a .50 caliber Browning machine gun, only to find the entire gun crew dead, killed moments earlier by strafing fire. The weapon was still intact, still warm, still pointed at the sky. He had never been trained on it. He was never allowed to be trained on it. That was the Navy's rule. But Japanese aircraft were diving right toward him, and no one else was left. He stepped behind the gun, gripped the handles, and squeezed the trigger. The Browning roared to life, bucking against its mount as spent brass clattered across the deck. Tracer rounds streaked upward in glowing lines. Miller tracked the dive bombers, their wings folding, their bombs releasing, their engines howling. He saw sparks leap from a Val dive bomber as his rounds struck its fuselage. Another plane wavered in flight after he tore pieces from its wing. He could not tell which ones he hit, which ones he damaged, which ones he drove off. He only knew he kept firing, sweating through his uniform, his hands burning on the overheated grips, the water cooling system hissing from the heat. He fired for about 15 minutes, going through belt after belt of ammunition until an officer shouted that they were out of rounds. The ship was sinking. They had to abandon their posts. But Miller didn't abandon anything. He rushed to help wounded sailors, dragging them toward the deck as smoke choked the passageways. Flames licked at bulkheads. The floor was slick with oil and blood. He carried men twice his size, pushed others up ladders, guided the disoriented toward the railings where they could jump into the water below. He passed the bridge one last time and saw Captain Bennion still lying where Miller had first found him, still giving orders despite his mortal wounds. Bennion died before 9 o'clock, refusing to leave the bridge even as the ship sank beneath him. The West Virginia settled to the harbor floor, her superstructure still above water but her interior flooded. Over 100 sailors died. Some were trapped in compartments where they would remain for days, knocking on the steel bulkheads until their oxygen ran out. Miller jumped overboard, swimming through water thick with oil, dodging patches of burning fuel drifting across the surface. The attack finally ended at 9:55. Pearl Harbor was devastated. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed. Hundreds of planes destroyed. Over 2,000 Americans dead. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. But no one asked Miller what he had done. He returned to duty, reassigned to the USS Indianapolis. Mealtime duties, cleaning, laundry, nothing changed. In the Navy's eyes, he was still just a mess attendant. But sailors talk. The story of the tall black mess attendant who manned a machine gun and fought back spread through the fleet. By January 1942, the black press was demanding answers. Who was the unnamed hero on the West Virginia? Why had the Navy not identified him? Why was a black sailor who had risked everything being ignored? Under growing pressure, the Navy finally confirmed his identity in March 1942. The story exploded across the country. For black Americans, Miller became a symbol, proof that courage did not have a color, proof that segregation was denying the Navy men who could fight. The Navy faced a dilemma. Miller had broken regulations, but he had done so heroically. Public attention forced their hand. On May 27, 1942, aboard the USS Enterprise, Admiral Chester Nimitz awarded Miller the Navy Cross, the first ever awarded to a black sailor. Nimitz praised him before thousands of assembled men. Miller stood stiffly at attention, uncomfortable in the spotlight, knowing that even this honor did not change his status. He was promoted, yes, but still a mess attendant, still barred from combat roles. The Navy used his image in recruiting posters. War bond tours followed. He gave short, humble speeches. He insisted he had simply done what needed to be done. Fame did not interest him. He wanted to return to sea. In 1943, he was assigned to the new escort carrier Liscum Bay. He cooked meals. He cleaned. But he also had a battle station now, a 20mm anti-aircraft gun. On November 24, 1943, near Macon Atoll in the Gilbert Islands, Miller took his post before dawn as the ship prepared for flight operations. The Japanese submarine I-175 lurked unseen beyond the destroyer screen. At 5:10, a lookout spotted a torpedo wake slicing toward the carrier. There was no time to evade. The torpedo struck near the engine room at 5:13. The explosion alone was devastating, but the torpedo had hit right beside the bomb magazine. A split second later, hundreds of aerial bombs detonated in a chain reaction that tore Liscum Bay apart from within. The blast shot a column of fire hundreds of feet into the sky. Entire sections of the ship vaporized. Debris rained down onto ships miles away. The aft half of the carrier ceased to exist. Over 600 men died instantly. Miller was never seen again. Some survivors recalled seeing him helping other sailors escape. Others thought he died in the initial explosion. No one knew for certain. The ship slipped beneath the waves in 23 minutes. Only 272 men survived. Miller was not among them. He was officially declared killed in action on the last day of 1943. In the years that followed, Miller became more than a hero. He became a symbol of what black Americans were forced to overcome to serve a country that did not yet serve them equally. His courage added weight to the movement that eventually desegregated the Navy and then the entire U.S. military. And though he never lived to see those changes, they were born from moments like the one when a young man from Waco stood behind a gun he wasn't allowed to touch and chose to fight anyway. Doris Miller did not set out to change history. He simply acted when action was needed, without permission, without hesitation, and without any guarantee that he would survive. His story remains one of the clearest reminders that heroism is not defined by rank, training, or the limitations placed on a person, but by what they choose to do when everything around them is burning.